click
I
go
love that.
live. Click. And we're live. It is Wednesday, April 7th, 2021, 5 o'clock p.m. And folks, I have a cool announcement to make. Tomorrow at 1 a.m., we are launching with our friends at Goat Rodeo a new podcast series. It'll be 6 episodes. It is called After Trump, and it is based on the book by Bob Bauer and Jack Goldsmith. It is hosted by the irrepressible Virginia Heffernan, who you know from Trumpcast and from repeated appearances on In Lieu of Fun. She will be joining us tomorrow to talk about it. And if I do say so myself, the first episode of it is pretty awesome. The Goat Rodeo team, Virginia, Bob and Jack, and our crew did a really good job of putting it together. It tells a pretty riveting story. We have appearances from Walter Schaub and David Korn and Mary Trump and David Farrenhold, all talking about Trump's financial conflicts of interest and what we might do about them in legislation and other things. There's a whole lot of discussion, Kate, of norms and of creating laws out of norms. And Bob Bauer, you will, if you have not already gotten to know Bob Bauer through many lawfare type appearances, you will find him the picture of good sense. Jack does not do as much in this episode because it's more about Bob's issues than Jack's. And so I hope you check it out. But I have bad news too. We are still not allowed to have fun anymore. It's 376 days into In Lieu of Fun. There's no fun to be had. And I have to tell you, when I first invited Chuck on the show months and months and months ago, I texted him and I said, do you want to come on In Lieu of Fun? And he responded, no, I'm the opposite of fun. So we're going to let you guys be the judge of that, whether Chuck is in fact the opposite of fun. But we're not allowed to have fun anymore. We are allowed to talk to Chuck Rosenberg, who has relented and agreed to come on the show. Chuck, it's good to see your face and welcome.
Thank you. In lieu of an interesting guest, Ben and Kate, here I am.
Well, okay, Ben, you're going to have to let me take one quick prerogative here. So I asked about the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is kind of amazing. I actually am now very pleased that I asked you that question because that was a great answer. And then now I want to know what your baseballs are.
Oh gosh, there are tons of baseballs here, Kate. There's a bucket of baseballs in the corner.
But the ones that are in the display cases over your left shoulder.
Yeah, so I'm not a big autograph collector, except in a couple of instances.
Interesting.
Cal Ripken, Tom Seaver, I'm a huge baseball fan.
I have a Tom Seaver glove. That's my glove.
I'm a huge baseball fan. So I have signed balls from Hank Aaron, Tom Seaver, Cal Ripken. Those are basically the things that are being displayed. And then I think an odd ball or two, but that's about it.
Here's a funny, so I used to be super into baseball as some of the people and here now I've just kind of lost track of my team, which was the Red Sox, after they got boring in my opinion. I guess I liked it for more romantic reasons than I thought. But my dad is a huge Red Sox fan still, and he has a ball that he has gotten signed by every person in the 1986 Bill Buckner play.
Wow.
So it was kind of cool that over the years he's got Bob Stanley and
Kate,
Mookie.
So Mookie, including the Mets, Mookie Wilson, Bob Stanley was on the mound.
Everyone that touched the ball in that play, it's just a random. It's just like kind of, you only would want it for like that specific reason. But he's not into autographs either, but he just kind of collected those on that ball, so it was kind of cool.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So a few weeks ago, I wrote a piece that got picked up not at all, and it was right after Chris Wray testified, and I just want to say I have no beef with Chris Wray. I'm not like gunning for his scalp or anything. But wrote a piece that said, look, the FBI had a catastrophic intelligence failure on January 6th. It is the agency principally responsible for terrorism prevention. The director boasted that he had 2,000 open investigations. Not one of those open investigations produced intelligence that would have, according to the director, would have stopped this attack. And by the way, lots of journalists in the days before the show, before the incident, were very open that the goal of this was to storm the Capitol. And in fact, we had a conversation with Steve Vladeck 2 days before the incident in which we discussed that there were plans to storm the Capitol, and that was the objective of this thing that was going to happen in 2 days. And we had a conversation about whether the Capitol Police were up to it. And Steve and I agreed that they were, in fact, up to it. And it was very foolish to try to storm the Capitol. We were dead wrong about that. But, that this event was going to happen was no secret to anybody who wanted to know about it. And I was quite shocked that Chris Wray got essentially no questions about how bad the intelligence failure on the FBI's part was. And I wrote a pretty grouchy piece about it, which got essentially no attention at all. The other day, you wrote a similar, less grouchy, more genteel, raising similar questions. And I want to start with the question, why is the Bureau getting such a free pass on its own institutional performance with respect to January 6th?
So in the best traditions of being a television analyst, let me not answer your question and say something else, Ben. I'm not entirely.
I love reading the stage directions of what you're doing, though.
Yeah.
I appreciate the transparency. It's refreshing.
Thank you, Kate. I knew one of the two of you would appreciate this. I'm not certain it was a catastrophic intelligence failure. I don't know what's in their holdings. I've never seen their analysis. I don't think the Norfolk Situation Intelligence Report has ever been made public. I was going after something else, Ben, in my more genteel article, which was either the Norfolk report. And by the way, I learned how to say Norfolk when I was in AUSA in Norfolk. If you want to have any credibility with the jury down there, it is not Norfolk. Either that was a compelling intelligence report, and it was helpful and it was transmitted in the right way, although it obviously was not, or it wasn't a helpful intelligence report, and it's not clear to me what the FBI is claiming. I mean, they're saying they delivered it in the right way and that it should have been helpful. They obviously delivered it in the wrong way, and I have no idea what it actually says. And so I was really going after I had a more narrow criticism, which was there's no way that emailing it and posting it to a law enforcement portal is the proper way to alert somebody if you think their house is on fire. And that was the metaphor I used. If my neighbor's house, if smoke was coming from my neighbor's house, I would get no credit for emailing him and posting my observation on a neighborhood blog.
Okay, but I'm not sure those 2 points are as different as your. So it seems to me if they had better holdings than they have reported, then the point that you're making is exponentially truer than, right? Then the problem is that they didn't transmit the Norfolk memo in the right way, and they didn't transmit anything else at all.
As far as we know, right? Because intelligence includes collection, analysis, and dissemination.
Right. So I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that they weren't sitting on significant relevant holdings that should have been transmitted and weren't.
Not purposely.
Yeah. In which case, if we assume either that they didn't have the information, that means they weren't reading the New York Times and the Washington Post and watching, cable news and watching in lieu of fun. And if they did have it, they didn't transmit it. It seems to me either way, that falls into the category of perhaps not an intelligence failure, but a failure of an intelligence agency.
There was a failure there. I mean, I was actually surprised, as I think you were. I have now gone back and read your very good article, and Ben, it deserves more attention than you say it got. But I was surprised that when Chris testified on the Hill, that the questions were so gentle and that they kept pointing to the three things that they did with that intelligence report. Briefed it at some JTTF gathering, posted it to a law enforcement portal, and emailed it to the Capitol Police. None of them are sufficient in my view. But I think what that really suggests is that if the Norfolk intelligence report was the best thing they had, then it probably wasn't particularly good and wasn't particularly helpful. And so I think the more credible answer was, we didn't have a good collection on this, or we didn't do good analysis of the collection we had, but we ought not to try and claim credit for emailing a, sort of not particularly insightful, not particularly helpful intelligence report to our law enforcement partners. I don't see why you get any credit for that. Now, having said that, look, I worked at the FBI. I love the FBI. I have tremendous faith in the FBI. I think they're really, really good at what they do. But if you define what they do as, reactive criminal enforcement, if you define what they do as intelligence, I think there are some challenges.
It really strikes me as from a civil procedure, from a civil procedure perspective, it strikes me as like the difference between taking out an ad in the local newspaper, as it to post like a housing transaction or something like that, or that there is someone has passed away and they're looking for descendants or something like that, versus a coming to your door and knocking on your door and serving you. Right. And like
exactly.
it's like it would be just as easy in the circumstances when you know where to find them. And this is what any court would say, where you know where to find them and you know what you have to tell them, go knock on their door. Like right. If you don't know where they are, where to find them, you post a general notice because you have nothing else, no other options.
Right. And part of my metaphor, my analogy, I've never known the difference between a metaphor and an analogy, but the
like or as or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know, Kate, but the point I made in the Post article was that if I saw smoke in my neighbor's house, I would bang on his door and call 911. Anything short of that is insufficient, right? And so you don't get credit for emailing somebody and telling them there's a fire. I guess it's better than doing absolutely nothing, but they email this stuff in the ordinary course of business. They post this kind of stuff to law enforcement portals in the ordinary course of business. They brief JTTFs in the ordinary course of business. If they decided that this was the ordinary course of business, to Ben's point, that's a different type of failure. But if they are really claiming that they had important intelligence information, then they failed to disseminate it in an appropriate way. And like I said, I am completely biased, and whatever I am, I will tell you that. I think the FBI does an exceedingly good job. I was proud to work there for 2 directors, but I don't think they get a pass on this one.
So I think your point is generalizable to a few other matters on which the director was also claiming credit. One is he's claiming credit for having a lot of investigations open, and he compares the number, I think he used 2,000 or something.
He said currently 2,000, which is twice as many as they had when he started.
Had 4 years ago, and like the last 4 years, yeah, they've doubled.
So I don't think you get credit for having lots of investigations open that did not provide actionable intelligence on the relevant matter, particularly when press organizations had actionable intelligence on the matter. It seems to me, this is I think there's a little bit of, I don't, this is a little bit untoward, but investigations porn going on here, where, the number of active investigations, and, you and like Comey used a similar use of numbers, but I think it was much more defensible when he was talking about ISIS, and he said, we have open ISIS investigations in all 50 states, hence I'm alarmed, right? But here there's an extra step going in, which is the number of investigations is supposed to reflect a degree of seriousness about it. But if you're thinking about intelligence, the relevant issue isn't the number of investigations. The relevant question is, why isn't any of these predicated investigations, presumably they're all properly predicated, why aren't any of them relevant to what's going on in the streets?
Yeah, well, fair question, Ben. So I don't think of the number of investigations, and I presume they are predicated, as being a proxy for anything other than the number of investigations. And like almost everything in life, there's a bell curve, right? Golf scores, IQ, height, everything is on a bell curve. And so are these investigations, presumably, with some on the right tail being extremely serious and sensitive and pressing, and a whole bunch on the left tail, which are just opened because you got to do something with the tip you got. And then there's a bunch in the middle. And I don't know exactly what the distribution of the curve looks like. So the number 2,000 to me is completely unhelpful. It's helpful when I compare it to 1,000, which I assume was also on a bell curve. But it doesn't, by in and of itself, tell me anything about how many are active, how many are pressing, how many are sensitive, how many are actually providing, important, actionable intelligence. 2,000 doesn't help me.
So what do you like? So what do you need? Like, what would be more helpful? So I feel like he gave us like to put it in kind of math terms, like he gave us a numerator, and what we don't have is the denominator. We don't know like how many other investigations total there are in the FBI. We don't know what this is like. Maybe, if they have like increased, like if there is also double the I don't know, any other types of investigations they're doing, then like maybe they're just cracking down in general, or they have like lowered the level at which like something counts as an investigation, right?
Yeah, no,
and like they're calling it an investigation.
No, Kate, it's an excellent question, and I take your numerator denominator analogy or metaphor to heart. When I ran another law enforcement agency, I remember being briefed once on the number of wiretaps we had, and my question was, so what? Is that good? Is that bad? Should we have more? Should we have less? How many of them are productive? How many are productive? How many are active? I don't know that having more. So first of all, bureaucracies, well, I guess all things, but bureaucracies tend to measure the measurable, right? If there's something you can count in a bureaucracy, you tend to count it. But that doesn't tell you anything about quality. It just gives you some insight into quantity. And so what I really want to know is not how many domestic terrorism investigations that they have, but are there, because whatever they have, but are their resources properly aligned to the most important domestic terrorism investigations? And if they're not, why not? And what do you need to do to align the resources? And if you need help, have you gotten it? And if you haven't gotten help, why not?
Okay, but here's where I want to get back to the grouchy point of my op-ed, which is, or my not op-ed, my way too long to be an op-ed.
Why have you not seen this? I missed this.
It was on lawfare. It just didn't.
I just must have missed it.
It didn't capture the zeitgeist of the moment, and so people didn't notice it. But look, it seems to me the prima facie case that the answer to your standard and question is no, it's not. And this is something that the director should have to answer for, is when you have a lot of open investigations that are not producing actionable intelligence vis-a-vis something large that's happening that other entities are aware of and in a position to predict. And I guess my question is that too mean a standard, or is that a like if why should I be able to say, hey, if I could know, and Vladik and I could have a conversation about, hey, we're going to have an effort to storm the Capitol in a couple days. It doesn't matter how many open investigations you have if you're a law enforcement / intelligence organization and you're not having that same conversation.
Well,
something went wrong.
So this is why I took a less grouchy, more narrow approach, Ben. Something went wrong with the dissemination of information to the Capitol Police on January 5th, the day before the riot. And something went wrong when the FBI seemed to get credit for the way in which they disseminated the information. I have no idea, and neither do you, whether they have passed other actionable intelligence to other agencies, whether it has been helpful, because if it is helpful and sensitive and ongoing, you ought not see it. And I have no problem with that. So I can't measure, frankly, how good the intelligence operation is. I saw a small piece of it between January 5th and January 6th, and I saw a very, very good agency and a very thoughtful director try and claim credit for something I didn't believe they deserved credit for. Full stop.
Yeah. I'm very, I think that this is highlighting also for me something that I've always kind of, I think that the notice, I like the narrowness of your notice point, because I think that it is a very strong argument. And if you're going to make an argument and you think that something is going to be able to get dismissed for lack of notice, and you can show that, then do that. I mean, I actually not to be super off the topic, but I just taught the gifts and the elements of a gift when I was teaching my property class, and we get to the last, and all of it is questionable in this one particular gift case that I was teaching. But what was really clear was that it hadn't been delivered, and it was so it was the strongest thing, and that's where you make your argument. None of the rest of this stuff is wrong, or everything else that Ben points out is not incorrect. It's just that I don't know. It reminds me that you come from a litigation perspective, that this is where you made your argument.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I should also point out, Kate, that in law school, property, my grade in property tied with my grade in just about everything else for my lowest grade in law school.
Did you get an A+?
No. Mm-mm. There was no A on my transcript as far as I can recall.
Oh my gosh, I love that story.
I was gonna pose the implicit bias question that I've railed about on this show a number of times with respect to the Bureau, but Paul Wexler has teased it in his question, so I'm going to audience questions a little early today. Paul, your thoughts?
Well, this question came to me from the 2016 election, when Comey took a second slice of the pre-election disclosure cake, when he talked about some of Hillary's emails being on Anthony Weiner's computer. And there was all sorts of chat in the media and the newspapers back then about how the New York office forced his hand, how there were Giuliani compatriots or sympathizers in the New York office, which they would have released the information if Comey hadn't. And I guess my question is, does the New York office really have a large segment of the Bureau that does have a large segment that leans to the right? And could that have influenced how the Bureau handled this intelligence during the run-up to January 6th?
So my sense, Paul, good question, thank you, is that law enforcement generally is right of center. And I know Jim had expressed concerns that if he didn't put the information out, it would have gotten out there anyway. And so better to put it out there in a controlled manner, although right before an election, it's pretty tough to control anything, than let someone else do it in an uncontrolled manner. And that may not be a sufficient explanation to a bunch of people, but my experience generally with the FBI, including the New York field office of the FBI, is that they're professionals and they are not, trying to undermine the director or democracy or Trump or Clinton. Do people leak? Yeah, they do it all the time. I mean, pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post on any day of the week, and there are plenty of leaks in there. But I don't think that was an overriding or overwhelming concern. So I guess I would take the first question and say, right of center, more conservative than liberal, but they're reasonably diverse places with a reasonably diverse set of people and thought. And I think Jim was concerned that if he didn't get it out, it would get out in some other fashion. It doesn't necessarily mean from, quote unquote, Giuliani cronies in the New York field office. There are lots of places where leaks occur, and the New York field office is not alone in that regard.
But what about the second question, the implication that a sort of latent conservative demeanor and sort of culture in the Bureau maybe didn't make people as alert to the threat that a bunch of conservative-leaning white guys gathering in Washington posed that they would have felt if the same group of people were, say, Muslim Americans.
This is your implicit bias point that I knew you were going to work in at some point, Ben. Look, it's hard to answer a question about implicit bias, which every human being carries for an organization, to aggregate something very individual and apply it to an organization. I actually think there's a more benign explanation, which is that for international terrorism, you don't ever have, you have designated groups, you don't have First Amendment issues, it's relatively easy to get a FISA, right? So the collection never abuts the First Amendment. And one of the points I tried to make in my article was that, I'm sorry, Kate, please go ahead.
No. I'll ask afterwards. Go ahead.
One of the points I tried to make is that the terrain for domestic terrorism is a little more difficult, and that the First Amendment concerns are more real than imagined and not well understood, and you get confusing signals from lawyers at the FBI and the Justice Department, and so more benign.
My only I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just kind of was thinking out loud. So that is true, but it also highlights for me something that I think I'm just coming straight out of teaching ECPA and then going into just all of the national security cases. And so one of the and then my own personal experience when I was clerking in the EDNY with a counterterrorism case, which was focused on a U.S. citizen that was Muslim and was young, his early 20s, and basically being kind of maybe radicalized in some way, or they had a reason to think he was radicalized, and then ultimately brought him against charges for false statements to the FBI. But that's an interesting thing, because I feel like there were a lot of, maybe that's anecdata, maybe that's just me extrapolating from my one scenario, but I thought that there were more cases in the guise of counterterrorism from extremists, but we weren't calling them necessarily domestic terrorists. We were thinking about them because they were being radicalized from outside the U.S. as counterterrorism, extremism, kind of external terrorism versus domestic terrorism. And I'm looking back at that. I'm like, which bucket would I put that in? I guess is kind of what I'm thinking. I mean, there were the same issues that you bring up, which is that he was a U.S. citizen. He had been raised in the U.S. So,
well, I could only say it this way, Kate. And by the way, I don't think there's a non-zero chance that implicit bias played some role. I'm just offering a more benign explanation. That said, if it's an international terrorism case and you can put it in that bucket, you have much more room to maneuver. And
with the court, absolutely, yeah.
And it's something that the FBI has gotten quite good at over the last 2 decades. And my fear is that domestic terrorism was always a bit of a afterthought. And so Now they have to readjust, they have to recalibrate. That may sound surprising, but that's my sense of it.
Ben, you're muted. I think there's the
Kate, why,
dogs are-
Kate, why did you
Why
tell
did
them
I?
that?
The 2 points are not at all inconsistent with one another.
No, they're not.
Right.
They're
So
not.
you can
Thank you.
totally,
Yeah.
there's no doubt in my mind that the challenges of purely domestic organizations where you don't have the material support law to work with, you have much more acute First Amendment issues, is part of what makes it difficult for the Bureau to figure out when they can and can't monitor social media. It is also the case that that's part of the reason these foreign terrorist foreign terrorism investigations, where they've had a lot of success, a lot of focus, are much more comfortable for them, because they fit into a template that the Bureau has spent the last 20 years getting really, really good at.
Right, but I think that's exactly right, Ben. And one of the points I made in my article, at least I hope I made it, is that pre 9/11, the template was sort of not well established. There was the FISA wall. It precluded intelligence sharing. I mean, they overcame that. Thank goodness. I was on the other side of the wall on a couple of espionage cases I prosecuted, and I can tell you why I didn't understand the origins of it. I saw the effects of it, and it was nuts. And so that they have to do this again. Kate, where do you teach, by the way?
I'm at St. John's Law School, and this is my student, Genevieve. Hello.
Genevieve.
Who has the next question?
And she had me for property.
I did.
But
is one of our best audience questioners.
Yeah, she's absolutely wonderful. She's totally wonderful. Hi. But I was gonna say, so one of the things that I was thinking about though is I'm going back and I just told all of my students that I taught wiretapping and kind of all of the national security cases too, that I would buy them and the Fourth Amendment privacy cases, because I have one set of students who is entirely international and kind of LLMs, and then I have one set of students that is domestic. And so it was like a really weird day, gotta be honest. Like, it was a really weird day to teach like Fourth Amendment for the first time to a bunch of US students who'd never learned it, and then to a bunch of international law students who'd never learned it. But I was thinking about, there's this one scene in The Wire, which is like one of the best pieces of art, I think, about everything that you do, Chuck, and like that you've done in the last couple of years. And there's this one, and like understanding the interaction between wiretapping warrants and Fourth Amendment warrants. But there's just one scene where he's talking to where McNulty, the protagonist, is talking to the FBI, and he says, "Why don't you want to do this anymore?" He's like, "We're getting out of the drug business. It's all counterterrorism now." And it's obvious, like looking back, but at the time, I think that was one of like a contemporaneous reflection of things that people didn't realize were being internally made with the agency and all their other types of things, that this was going to be the focus going forward, and reflects like domestic criminal activity blending into domestic terrorism, blending into international terrorism. And I just think that it's an interesting cultural shift that's happened.
It is, and it requires some recalibration. No question about it, Kate.
Yeah.
Genevieve, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, let me find my question. Are there any reforms that you think should be implemented to increase transparency between the FBI and the public? And I'm particularly thinking of in the area of domestic terrorism in almost the converse way that you would think, because is there anything the public can do to aid in like reporting or spotting threats or aiding officers in their investigations?
So Genevieve, I think you're going to hate my answer.
That's okay.
But generally, coming from a federal law enforcement background, I'm not a huge fan of transparency, particularly when it comes to investigations, for a whole bunch of reasons. I think that and by the way, and again, my bias, Genevieve, I trust these agencies to do what we want them to do the overwhelming percentage of the time in the right way. And so it's really important to me that the investigations are secret. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, right? You don't want to tell people when you're coming for officer safety reasons. You don't want to tell people what you're doing because they destroy evidence or they flee. You also don't want to tell people what you're doing because it may turn out that the people you're targeting in your investigation didn't do anything wrong. And so, we can absolutely communicate better, no question about that. And we need the public to help, right? We asked, you remember there was that video that the FBI put out of the guy walking through the back alleys, planting pipe bombs at the RNC and DNC. They asked for help. They got it. Don't know if their help was helpful, but they certainly got it. How to make the same very difficult decision, Genevieve, with white hat, black hat after the Boston Marathon bombing, asking the public for help. They got it. In that case, the help was helpful. So, when you talk about transparency, I think you have to break it down into their investigative work, which shouldn't be transparent until and unless charges are filed publicly. And then the community outreach piece of it, where they talk to the public about what they're doing, what their priorities are, what their successes are, by the way, what their failures are too, and when they need help, they ask for it. That's how I think about it.
Can I
And by the way,
follow up on that, Chuck? Because it seems to me there's a real difference between transparency in an investigative phase and transparency in a situation in which we know a failure has taken place.
Yeah, no, and that's what I was just referring to, Ben. They have to tell us about their failures when they make them. I think, if you remember the Charleston shooting, Dylan Roof at the Black church in Charleston.
Of course.
There was a huge FBI mistake in the NICS check. And I don't remember precisely what happened, but Dylan Roof was a prohibited person and should not have been able to purchase the gun that he used. And Comey
didn't he get that at like a, what am I remembering? Didn't he get it at like a gun show?
No,
no, he didn't.
He got it either in Columbia or West Columbia and the South Carolina, and the FBI checked one, but not the other. Someone out there will know precisely the details. But there's a more important point, Ben, to what you were saying. When Comey, who was director at the time, learned of that, he called in the National Press Corps and said, "We blew it. Here's what we should have done. Here's what we did. Here's how we're going to fix this thing going forward."
But this seems to me to be the opposite of what Ray did here. And I'm as I said in the piece, I'm less upset with Ray than I am with Congress for allowing him but Comey didn't say, "Let me tell you all the things we did right with Dylan Roof. We had 2,000 open gun investigations."
Right.
And I think that there's I actually agree with you. I think there's transparency in real time in investigations is a way overvalued commodity. But I do think for that position to be sustainable, there has to be a real openness to after action accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. And that requires the media and Congress to do their jobs. And I think at least with the description of what the FBI did with the Norfolk report, I don't think the press or Congress was particularly dialed in.
A concerned citizen has a question.
Hi, thanks for letting me ask a question. Thanks for another great show. Mr. Rosenberg, I'm a big fan of your podcast, The Oath. It's really good.
The most earnest podcast on iTunes.
Well, thank you. That's all. It's a real privilege for me to talk to some of the folks that have come on the show, and I appreciate your saying that.
It's so good, The Oath.
Thank you.
It's a terrific piece of work.
My question, 57 out of 100 senators voted to convict Trump for incitement of insurrection, and some who voted no said they thought he did it. McConnell alluded to possible criminal repercussions for his incitement of insurrection.
Yeah.
If Trump incited insurrection while pushing Congress and Pence to overturn the election results, wouldn't that be an attempted coup? And given that the impeachment managers made a case that convinced several GOP senators, should investigators look at Trump, and what charges might he face?
Yeah, I mean, I think of insurrection as sort of a criminal legal word, and coup as a political word. So
Yes.
if you're talking about
Really good distinction. Yeah.
if you're talking about charges, right, then theoretically, I think insurrection would be the right one, a seditious conspiracy, perhaps. But that's a really, really hard thing to prove. I don't have the statute in front of me, but pull it out, because political rhetoric is often heated, often ugly, and it's unclear to me that Donald Trump could form the mens rea to commit any crime. So
Sick burn.
So I think there are probably criminal investigations going on right now that should be more concerning to him, particularly what Cy Vance is doing in Manhattan. I don't think that the one in Georgia particularly has teeth to it. Again, if you look at the Georgia statute, I think it's a pretty difficult leap for them to sort of make out criminal liability. So, your question is a good one, but it strikes me more that the repercussions there ought to be political and not criminal legal. I mean, it's still, what he did was abhorrent. Don't get me wrong. It was absolutely disgusting. In no way do I condone it. I am not convinced as a former federal prosecutor that criminal legal sanctions would lie here.
Tony Cava, the floor is yours.
Hey, how is everyone? I wore a dog shirt for you today, just so you know.
That's a pretty good
That
dog
is
shirt.
excellent. What does it
That is a
say?
dog
I do
shirt.
what?
I do what I want.
Says,
Excellent.
I filled it in for you. I didn't even know.
obviously,
What kind of dog do you have,
it's
Tony?
Totally.
Tony has
A
Momo.
long-haired English cream dachshund.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful little
And,
puppy. He looks the same
obviously,
coloring and
since I'm
look as
working
mine. Sorry,
Yeah.
Tony.
And obviously, since I'm working today, that's okay, Kate. The shirt is full of it. Honestly, it's not true. I was wondering, we've talked about the role of the legislature and of the FBI. Wondering if we could talk briefly about the role of the judiciary in the response to the insurrection. And particularly, I'm not a lawyer, but it strikes me that the defendants are being treated with kid gloves, considering the amount of evidence and the type of evidence. And I'm just wondering if you agree with that. I'm wondering if that is indeed the case and why you think that might be. And also, and not to be conspiratorial, if there may be some magistrates who are sympathetic to Trump's cause and they may be, acting on that sympathy.
Tony, you do know that whenever someone starts a sentence by saying not to be conspiratorial, what typically follows.
Stroke your beard, Tony, like this.
With all due respect, what's that mean when you start it?
It's precisely the same thing. That if you said to me with all due respect, I would hear it as, Chuck, you're a blithering idiot. So let me answer that. As a former federal prosecutor, there's a couple of things I think you have to keep in mind. Overwhelmingly, most of the people who have been charged in connection with the January 6th riot have been charged with relatively minor crimes. Destruction of property, trespassing, and the like, right? Failure to disperse. I'm not entirely sure what
no felonies.
But relatively few. Number two, Tony, federal law, the Federal Criminal Code requires that in making bond determinations or release determinations, that federal magistrate judges, I'll get the exact language wrong, but it use the least restrictive combination of conditions to reasonably assure the appearance of the defendant at future proceedings. Meaning, if you were to take it out of legalese and put it into, real American English, people ought to be released when they can be released. If they're a risk of flight, no release. If they're a danger to the community, no release. If they commit an offense where there's a rebuttable presumption against release, then probably no release. But for the overwhelming majority of people charged on January 6th at the Capitol, the crimes would not be serious enough to warrant detention. Moreover, you also look at whether or not they have a criminal record. So if Kate was there on January 6th and broke a window to get in and stole Speaker Pelosi's pen, but has no prior criminal record, there isn't a chance in hell she's going to be detained pending trial.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the problems would be that we would probably end up holding her longer pre-trial.
Well, little do you know that I own my own plane and I have 10 different passports in different countries. So,
well, not little do I know. Now I know. But there'd be a risk that she would be held longer pre-trial in detention than she would ever be sentenced for the underlying crimes. And so all of that stuff factors in to bond determinations.
People also forget, it's a really important point in this context, along the lines that Chuck is describing, that the individuals are not charged with the aggregate conduct of the mob. The individuals are charged with very specific things that they did. And so a lot of people are looking at it and saying, oh my God, the mob did this and they threatened to kill Mike Pence and they, and there was, a person killed and there was two Capitol Police committed suicide later, one died, but the individual before the judge is charged with trespassing on government property, breaking a window.
Criminal liability is person by person, and it has to be that way, because
unless it's conspiratorial, but even then.
Well, if you conspired with Ben, Kate, to damage property, then it's still a minor conspiracy. If you conspired with Ben to come to my house and kill me, that's a more serious conspiracy. Right. You wouldn't get held for the first one. You might get held for the second. But these determinations, to Ben's point, are always person by person, not mob and incident by mob and incident.
And critically, the acid test of whether judges are being too lenient is whether people are failing to show up for their court hearings, because the individuals are innocent until proven guilty. The only job of pretrial detention, other than to protect the community, is to make sure that people show up. Well, so if somebody is showing up and hasn't done any harm in the interim, 100%. Then the bail determination is correct and reasonable.
And by the way, Tony, so not to be an apologist for magistrate judges, which is to say I'm about to be an apologist for magistrate judges, but I don't think they are. There's any conspiracy there. I don't think they are evincing a preference for Trump or his politics. Here's the thing. If you're charged with a relatively minor crime and you don't show up to face the consequences of it, you will be charged with a relatively major crime. You'd have to be an idiot not to come back to court on trespassing, right? And in lieu of being charged because
in lieu of fun, being charged with in
obstruction
lieu of,
of justice, in lieu of fight to avoid prosecution. So
well, I mean, you jump bail, you sacrifice the money, obviously, which is the whole point is to make it enough money that you wouldn't want to sacrifice it, and then it's. But you're right.
Most people don't do that though, Kate. Most people show up.
Yeah. I know. So my parents are both trial judges. So there's in the state system, and so there's but this is not criminal, but this is kind of, and it's also kind of, I think the one thing that both Ben, you didn't mention is when all of these things, this is all done in an arraignment hearing, which is a series of people, if people have never been to criminal court or it's a series of people coming up and being presented and the charges being presented against them and the judge having a sheet in front of them and a recommendation from the prosecutor and kind of whoever else is involved, and it like depends on like what the charges are in criminal court and like everything else, like about like whether they want to release them on like on bond or on bail, like it depends. And there's a recommendation, and like as I think as Chuck like perfectly laid out, you kind of go through this recommendation. It is not super political. It's just it is just a determination, and people forget this. Because it's all political to them because it's all the mob.
But the statutory requirement is the least restrictive combination of conditions that will reasonably assure their appearance. That's the law.
David Botts, the floor is yours.
I'm loving that.
Yeah, well, Nina in the laundry.
So Chuck, that's my laundry pile and my dog in it. I posted that on Twitter.
And below it is the fox dressed as a monk that was this morning's Good Morning image.
Oh, nice.
From 15th, 16th century Denmark.
Cool. That's awesome. I have to go look at that.
So thanks, Ben, for bringing me on, and thanks to Concerned Citizen for the pro tip on the Oath podcast. I'll have to check that out. How do you explain the apparently relaxed response of the FBI really following July 6th? In particular, Director Wray, why wasn't he front and center? I guess especially after January 20th, where maybe he was afraid that Trump would fire him, but why is he not doing press conferences every week talking about arrests? Why isn't he on 60 Minutes instead of some authorized dude who is wrecking pieces?
David, that's a great question. So I know Chris and like Chris, and again, so here's my bias. Well, that's my bias. Here's my answer. Chris doesn't like that. Chris is a very sort of, I hate to call him shy, but he doesn't like the limelight. He is a public figure who doesn't like public speaking. He's more of an internal director, the way Bob Mueller was. I agree with you, David. I think it's a great question that, there are times, to the earlier question from Genevieve about transparency, that we need to hear from our leaders. And I wish that Chris was more comfortable doing the types of things you just described. We ought to be hearing about the arrests. He ought to be on 60 Minutes. He ought to be reassuring the nation that the FBI has aligned their resources to their priorities. That's just not who he is. He's a very cerebral guy. He's an absolute gentleman. He's a very civil guy, a thoughtful guy, but he's an internal director. Jim Comey was very much more comfortable speaking publicly and did it often and did it well. They're different models, but there are times, I think, when even if it's uncomfortable for you, you have to do things you don't like. And I think we ought to hear more often from Chris.
Daniel, the floor is yours for one of your extremely pithy questions.
So I'm wondering what you miss most about working at the FBI.
I miss the
like
mission, Daniel.
I
miss the mission. I miss the people. I loved my work there. It was really, really cool. But, it was also hard. I mean, when I worked for Bob Mueller at the FBI, I got in every morning at 5:15. And I got home, every night at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And that was 6 days a week. So I don't really miss that.
Oz.
Oh, thank you. Mostly what I have were a couple of questions over here. Did the FBI act responsibly January 6th? And the other two questions are, was the director playing both sides? Playing a little too safe, not knowing what was going to happen? And ultimately, is the Director Wray the right person to lead the FBI post January 6th? I think America feels like there was a substantial change to what happened to our democracy. So is he the right person to stay on the job? Thank you for taking my question.
Is he the right person, Oz? Look, I mean, what I said earlier about Chris, I will say to you, he's smart, he's honest, he's decent, he's a man of tremendous integrity. So in that respect, absolutely, he's the right person to lead the FBI. I would like to see Chris get a little bit out of his comfort zone and do some of the other things that Jim Comey did so well. Is he playing both sides? I don't think so. But again, maybe it's my bias getting in the way of my answer. I really, truly, genuinely like Chris. I also really, truly, genuinely want him to succeed. And as a citizen, I want the bureau that he leads to succeed. So hold on one second. There's somebody outside my window. I'm also I distribute equipment for Arlington Little League. So
I love that. We might need to. Wait,
do you need to take a moment?
You need to go take
no,
it,
I gave him the thumbs up. It's all on. It's all
You're
outside.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Oz,
I used to sell hot dogs for my local Little League.
yeah. So I don't want Chris to go anywhere, and I really want the FBI to succeed, and I don't think he's playing both sides. Is my bias getting in the way of my answer? Yeah, probably.
Can I just say, as somebody who does not share Chuck's bias, I don't know Chris Wray. I'm not I don't have strong feelings about him personally one way or the other, and he's actually done some things that I don't admire, as well as some things that I think are quite admirable. That said, removing him from office would be, there are reasons not to do that have nothing to do with his performance, which is Trump took a meat hook to the institution of the 10-year directorship of the FBI. And I think it would be defensible for Joe Biden to say, hey, this guy was installed in a very unpalatable and bad way, and I don't want to honor this. But if he did that,
I disagree with you, Ben.
he would end the institution forever. And I don't want to see the institution of the 10-year directorship destroyed. And so I think you can say, while in the abstract, you can have a legit conversation about whether he's the right guy for the job, you have to also ask the question, how damaging would it be to remove him? And I think the answer to that is pretty damaging.
Look, I disagree with you in the following respect, Ben. I agree that Trump deeply undermined the institution of justice, the rule of law, all that stuff. But I don't think that gives Biden any right or reason. I mean, he certainly has the authority, but I don't think it gives him the right or the reason to remove Chris. Chris was nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate to a 10-year term. He's done, you might not like him, you might not know him, but I don't think he's done anything to warrant removal.
I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, I don't actually think that's why I think you're maybe not disagreeing with each other.
My point is that you could make an argument if you were a Democratic partisan.
I don't think you can.
You could say, well, Trump did it and people didn't object too strongly. Therefore, it's legitimate to do. I think that is before you get to the question of should you remove Chris Wray and replace him, you should face the question, is that a tradition you want to participate in, this dismantling of the 10-year term? And I agree with you that the answer to that should be no.
Well, and don't forget, I mean, Mueller was a 12-year term, or a 10-year term and a 2-year term, and Free served for 7. So this thing is not and Hoover for 48. So it's not quite as sacrosanct as you make it out to be.
Michael, you get the last question tonight.
Oh, wow. Is this working?
Yeah.
Yes.
Are we good? Okay, fantastic. Wow, I was a little concerned. Well, first off, Ben and Kate, thank you very much for what you've put together. It's pretty remarkable.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
This is your first time actually on screen, right?
Yeah, I've been a lurker at some points and sometimes a complainer.
I like your Swedish background. Take that,
may Michael be a model to you all of going from lurker to active participant.
And at times I get very bashful, so it's even harder. So,
well, we'll wait a few times before we start making fun of you like we do to Daniel and Genevieve.
Well, yeah, it's definitely deserved, and also I've really enjoyed the Oath as well. I've listened to it a bunch, and I guess especially the ethos behind the show where there's so much lack of public service these days.
You know, Michael, the whole idea behind, I guess the conceit of the show is that we don't talk about politics. It's nonpartisan. We don't talk about current events. It's about service, integrity, humility, honor, decency. I don't think those things are out of fashion. I just don't think we talk about them enough.
Yeah, no, I appreciated how much of that was implicit in the show, and that some of these things should not have to be commented upon all the time to behave that way.
Yes, sir.
Along those lines, I've been frankly kind of surprised by the canonization of Bob Mueller, whom I know you hold in the highest of esteem.
I do.
And when I hear people talk about him, I hear people basically describing him as George Marshall, and which I love that type of public service, and I have all sorts of times for George Marshall. But from the overreaction to 9/11 to his recent performance, I've been left wanting, and I've never personally understood the canonization of him in the sphere. And I'm sure I hear the same thing from everybody that works with him, and so I know it's true, but I just don't understand it.
Everybody who has worked for him adores him.
Without exception.
Without exception. I used to say that I would walk barefoot on broken glass for Bob Mueller, and that working for him often felt that way.
I'm only sad that I don't get to see the Bob Mueller puppet all the time anymore.
Right, but
because of Ben's new hammock perch.
But Michael, I know folks were disappointed with some of what the Mueller team decided, that they pulled some punches, or they didn't make a recommendation, or they didn't subpoena the president. I'm somewhat again, my bias, but I'm somewhat loath to criticize those determinations without being in the room when the decision was made. Look, I have said on television that I thought it was important to get Trump on the record, to subpoena him, to have that fight. And I also recognize I wasn't in the room for that determination. I was not disappointed that Mueller didn't make a prosecutive recommendation, because I never expected that he would. I was frankly disappointed that Bill Barr mischaracterized the Mueller report. If you actually read the Mueller report, both volume 1 about Russian interference and volume 2 about obstruction, all 448 pages, and I read the damn thing twice. It's incredibly damning, to use the same word twice in the same sentence. So I don't think Mueller pulled punches. I don't think his team missed stuff. I might disagree as an outsider on some of their strategic decisions, but I think they did an extraordinary job. And I'm angry not with them. I'm disappointed not with them, but in the political leadership at the time.
Yeah, can I just add to that everything Congress and Bill Barr needed to do their jobs honorably was in that document. Yeah. And people can have whatever strategic complaints they want, and there are questions that I wanted answered that document doesn't answer. But if you were a member of Congress, speaking of oaths, who swore an oath to preserve and protect the Constitution, and you had access to that document, you had all the information you needed in order to do your job. That was Bob Mueller's job, was to prosecute people who needed to be prosecuted and to provide other decision makers the raw material they needed to think about their own functions. And he did that.
Bob Mueller became the vessel into which we poured all of our hopes. And that was, I think, both misguided and unfair. To Ben's point, that report is extraordinary. If you don't have the patience for 448 pages, and I fully get that, read the 2 executive summaries in front of volumes 1 and 2.
Or listen to the Report podcast from Lawfare. And by the way,
I feel like Quinta has the entire report downloaded in her brain somewhere.
Yes, she does.
that wouldn't surprise me, Kate.
But before we let you go, Chuck, I would be remiss if I didn't make you tell the story of your job interview with Bob Mueller, because it brings together baseball and terror of Bob Mueller and all other things that are good.
I
love this.
In lieu of fun, I will tell the story of my interview with Bob Mueller. So I had been a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia for about a decade and left in 2000. And right after the attacks of 9/11, desperately wanted to get back into government. And through a friend of a friend, learned that Mueller was seeking to hire a counsel or counselor for national security. It was only a 2 or 3 person office. The director's staff is tiny. And so even though I knew of him, I had never met him. He is an icon in our Department of Justice. And somehow I got an interview with the man, and I was nervous, and I was excited, and I was anxious, and I was eager. And I had been forewarned to wear a white shirt, which wasn't a problem because that's all I have. I'm ushered into the man's office, the director of the FBI, on the 7th floor of the Hoover building, and there he is. He's standing behind his desk with his back turned toward me, reading something. And his assistant said, Mr. Director, Mr. Rosenberg is here. He comes out from behind his desk. He doesn't shake my hand. He doesn't say hello. He doesn't invite me to sit down. He doesn't say, how are you? How's your morning? He doesn't say anything other than, why do you want to work here?
What a boss.
And
it gets worse.
I mumbled something in response about, country and duty and sacrifice. And he said, all right, why do you think you'd be any good at this? And I talked to him, I mumbled something about, being an AUSA and knowing the FBI and admiring them and wanting to contribute. And literally, my story telling you how long my interview took is 7 times longer than my actual interview. The whole damn thing was like 9 seconds, at which point Mueller says, great, thanks for coming by. And he starts to walk me out of his office. 2 questions, 2 answers, great, thanks for coming by. And he's walking me out of my office. So I'm thinking to myself, Ben and Kate, this is the worst interview of my life. This man hates me. He hates me. I got to do something to salvage this. And so as I'm being ushered out, there's a baseball on one of his shelves. And I love baseball, as I mentioned earlier. And I said, I'm thinking to myself, how can I salvage this? I know. And I said to him, oh, there's a baseball. I said, Director, I see you're a baseball fan. And he says, nope. And out the door I go.
I didn't see that coming at all. I was like, oh, this is
no, it's not over.
Not over. So I remember thinking, worst interview of my life, utter disaster. The man hates me. I went back to my office, forlorn, depressed, certain that I have to continue at this law firm where I was hating life. And about an hour and a half later, the phone rings, and I pick it up, and I said, Chuck Rosenberg, and the voice on the other end says, Mueller here. And he doesn't say, it was a pleasure to meet you or really enjoyed our conversation. He literally says, when can you start? And I said, how about 2 weeks, sir? And he said, see you in 2 weeks. And he hung up on me. And that's Bob Mueller. Because as it turns out,
this is what I aspire to do the next time I interview somebody for a job.
As it turns out, virtually all the meetings in Bob's office were stand-up meetings. Because if you actually sit down, that takes 10 or 12 milliseconds. And 10 or 12 milliseconds cumulatively over a 12-year period would add up to minutes. And he's obviously not willing to waste that amount of time on any of the niceties of sitting down or asking about your day or about, your why your arm's in a cast or whatever the case may be. It's like, why do you want to work here? Why do you think you'd be any good at it? Get the hell out of my office.
Oh my God.
We're going to leave it there.
And I adore the man.
Straight out of Central Casting or something. This is like an incredible story.
So I once talked to somebody who was in a position similar to Chuck's vis-a-vis Bob Mueller at one point, and really described at great length the pain of working for him, how this weird combination of admiration and anxiety that it induced.
Abject fear.
And I said, do you like him? And he said, I don't know how to answer that question. And I said,
Yeah.
well, let me put it a different way. If he called you, this was during the special counsel investigation, if he called you tomorrow and said, I need your help, would you drop everything going on in your life to do it? He said, oh, of course.
Ben, as I said earlier, I would walk barefoot on broken glass for the man. Thank God for Bob Mueller.
We're going to leave it there.
What an incredible testimony and kind of like interesting. Like, man, I hope someone good writes his biography, because I like these things need to come out somewhere. This is wonderful.
Well, listen to, so on The Oath, in season 4, Bob Mueller is our first episode and our last. He is a Vietnam War hero. He's a 3-star sport star athlete in high school. Went to Princeton and UVA law because he survived Vietnam, where he described his greatest fear as letting his men down, which meant that they would perhaps die or be terribly wounded under his command. Because he survived, he came back to the United States and decided that he had to spend the rest of his life in public service. He was privileged enough to live. By the way, as a Princeton student, he could easily have found ways to avoid the draft. When a lacrosse teammate named David Hackett went to Vietnam, a Princeton lacrosse teammate went to Vietnam and was killed there. That was one of the reasons Bob joined the Marine Corps.
What a
beautiful sentiment.
I worked for somebody who has a not wholly dissimilar story. It was Don Graham, and the letters between Don Graham and his mother, Kay Graham, about why Don insisted on going to Vietnam are really amazing letters. She published them in her memoir, and they drip of the same sense of service. And we're going to leave it there. Chuck Rosenberg, you're a great American. The public vote on whether you are, in fact, the opposite of fun is 93% to 7%.
I'm voting yes.
Okay, so you've gotten it down to 92 to 8%.
Okay, I voted yes.
You've lost, which is to say you've won, which means you have to come back.
This was so fun. Please do come back. I want to hear about the Little League team. I mean, maybe you don't want to talk about it, but or anything else, honestly.
Thanks for having me, guys.
But in the meantime, tomorrow we have Virginia Heffernan. Maybe we'll ask Bob and Jack and Ian Enright to join us. We're going to talk about the new podcast series that you should all subscribe to this evening or this tomorrow morning. And all that will start 22 hours and 42 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we can have baseballs but still dislike baseball.
There we go. See you tomorrow, guys.